Section 12 of A Bunch of Keys, Where They Were Found and What They Might Have Unlocked, a Christmas book, edited by Tom Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Key of the Study, Part 1, by W.J. Prowse. There is still, upon the table of the study, a plain old writing case, with here and there some dark stains upon it that have been there for years, which no one has effaced or will seek to efface. As the dull night closes in, and the thickening gloom of the shadows fills the room, a big man, bearded and brown, sits wearily by the hearth, smoking, and gazes intently at the fire. Pictures enough he sees there, but in not one of them any hope for the future, in not one of them any consolation, for the pictures are all pictures of a past whose soul and life have gone out of him, leaving him in middle age thus lonely and thus miserable. And yet, as he looks, he seems to see, wistfully regarding him from the very heart of the fire, a face, no longer indeed bright and cheerful, but sombre in its melancholy beauty, which might make him very happy even now, but for stern restrictions and restraints. Soon the image fades away, and in its place comes that of an old man, grey-haired, and with an awful look of pain in the dark eyes, and he turns with a dull sob from the fire to the table with the writing-case. No need to tell him what the stains mean, for there again passes through his soul the misery, acute and sudden, of a night long ago. Outside the old house the wind is rising. We change the scene. The theatre is full, and there is a burst of plaudits as the great actress sweeps upon the stage, with her long black tresses flowing negligently behind, with her dark eyes fixed and solemn. And again there is a burst of plaudits when the wonderful voice, the voice that seems almost breaking with its heavy burden of passion long suppressed, fills the great house with the glory of its sound. She can play upon 1,000 hearts as the artist upon his violin can touch what string he likes, and make it vibrate tremulously at his will. But as for her own heart, can she rule that? When the play is over, when she has reached her home, see how wearily she too sinks into her chair by the fireside. Once only she rouses herself from her dull lethargy. It is when her husband enters the room, and then, petulantly, not with the strong sweet accents that have so sovereignly swayed the crowd, but with almost the peevishness of a sick girl, she tells him she is weary, and implores him to be gone. For her, too, there are pictures in the fire. From whence had they started? This broken man, this broken woman. The story is a long one. It takes us back 20 years. Of the 3 persons named, only 2 then knew each other. The third, you perceive, the husband, intrudes. Let us get away from that lonely study, in which the soldier still broods over his grief. Let us get away from the actress's home, where she mourns over the past. Let us get out into the open air, and take the story up where it began, just 20 years ago. Captain Grant, who had served with much honour in India and elsewhere, was then a widower, 45 years of age, and with one son, Donald, a lad of 18. He lived in an old house that had been inhabited by his family for many generations in Argyllshire, not far from the shores of Loch Awe, and his life was happy enough, for, after much hard fighting and many wounds, he was yet alert and hale, and saw his son growing up from a glorious boy into a glorious man. The youngster had never left that lonely but beautiful region, nor had he yet felt any desire for a different life. There was no keener angler, no surer shot in the whole county. The mere physical enjoyment of existence was vouchsafed him in full measure, and it was spiritualized, too, by an intense love for natural beauty. The mystery of the lonely tarn, the weird wonder of the mountain mist, the glory of a highland cataract roaring in flood, and the luxury of the purple heather, all these thrilled him with a vague delight, which was the more powerful because he had as yet no morbid anxiety to know its source. Very noble was the love between father and son. Both were so proud of each other. Both could trust each other so thoroughly. As they strode along over the moors, gun in hand, you could hardly see 2 finer types of manhood. The father knew no reason why his happiness should be disturbed, for it was then purest when his son shared it with him. Captain Grant had lived hard in his time. His youth had been stormy and passionate, but at length he was won over to a better life by the lady whom he married, and there had since been only one heavy cloud upon him. It was that which darkened his home when she died. But now this had also passed into a tender and gentle memory. which lent an inexpressible charm to his affection for his son. To keep this son out of temptations under which he himself had often fallen, to rear him into a gallant gentleman, pure and truthful and brave, these were the captain's aims, and for 18 years he had no fear of their realization. Of late, however, there was something in the lad's manner which, to eyes that saw keenly because love lent them force, denoted a critical change, and the captain beheld it with a certain glee, if also with a certain fear. He knew its meaning, did this good gentleman. He knew that his son must have discovered the existence in our charming world of a beauty which beats that of tarn, moorland, and stream. Now the captain, having had his own experiences in these matters, was not surprised to find that the boy was often melancholy without seeming cause, that he grew, in fact, a little less earnest about salmon and grouse, and a little fonder of long walks without either rod or gun. Noticing the change, the worthy old warrior did not ask himself the question, "What is it?" The worthy old warrior only asked himself the question, "Who is she?" Whereupon, taking counsel with himself alone, as became a good gentleman who had seen much of the world and its ways, he revolved within his brain the names of all the eligible young ladies in the district whom his son had seen. He knew enough to believe that an early marriage to a true helpmeet is the grandest happiness that a young man can have, and is also his stoutest shield against evil and sorrow. If Donald were in love with Lucy Stewart, or Flora Lennox, or any other Scotch maiden whose father's lands lay near his own, and whose blood was as pure as that of the Grants themselves, why there could be no earthly cause to prevent Donald after a few years from marrying her. He could have wished that the lad would tell him at once, but he knew that young love is seldom confidential at its commencement, that it broods upon itself, and finds something very sacred in its secrecy. So, without any serious misgivings, the father waited until his son, who hitherto had kept nothing hidden from him, should ask his aid in this matter also, in which position of affairs there existed the elements of great happiness for both of them, if Donald had selected an eligible young lady. If, on the contrary, Donald had not, well, there was the chance of an awkward explosion, for the captain, with all his affection, had in him great faculties of anger, and the fierce family pride of a Highland squire, but as yet he had no reason to believe that Donald had made any unworthy choice. The lad had been kept free from the dangers of the city, and the captain knew, from the clear, bright eyes which met him so frankly and so lovingly every day, he knew, from his son's ruddy cheeks, from the eager, exuberant health that seemed to breathe in his every movement, that Donald was as pure as a girl in her nursery, whilst he was as strong and as brave as became the son of a soldier. Without laying traps, then, for the lad's secret, he watched that magnificent young animal's movements with a curiosity which was not absolutely free from a certain sense of amusement. Donald Grant went up Glenorchy early one September morning. The glen is one of the loveliest in Scotland. There is nothing grand about it. None of the savage sublimity of Glencoe, for instance. It grows very fine, it is true, as it widens out towards Loch Awe, with the rugged outline of Ben Louis on the one side, and the massive bulk of Cruachan on the other. But to anyone who comes upon it after traversing the loneliness of the Black Mount, or the wide waste moorland that stretches away from Glenetiv up to Lochranach, it is apt to seem tame. Wander down the glen quietly, however, following the course of the stream, and you soon begin to recognize a peculiar and delicate charm about the valley. You have had your fill of ruggedness and desolation, and there is a wonderful sense of rest and peace in the rich woodlands that border the stream. Not that the Orchy is a tame and sluggish river, winding on past melancholy willows so slowly that you can scarcely tell which way it is going, if, indeed, it is going at all. No, it is always brisk and rapid, and when a night's rain has helped it, it rushes down to Loch Awe with all the speed and glory that beseem a Highland river. Thus coursed it when Donald went up along its banks. The morning was exquisitely bright. The mists that had been thronging round Cruachan for days had passed away in frantic wreaths and curls, and in the clear air every crag of the grand old mountain seemed distinct and close. Striding along, the lad was soon some miles up the glen, and close to the falls. The sunshine played marvellous tricks amongst the pine trunks, and seemed absolutely to glow and burn where it struck upon the red berries of the mountain ash. Musically murmured the Orchy, swelling into a more solemn song as the lad drew near the great boulders over which the river rushes to the deep pools beneath, and the sky was flooded with light, and the air was flooded with music, and the heart of the lad was flooded with love. As he paused near the cascade and looked around him, He seemed a natural part of the glorious scene. The place would have been lonely, perchance. Something of its charm would have gone out of it had it lacked that tall young fellow with the keen bright eyes that glanced about so eagerly, with the long golden hair that danced so merrily, with the manly form, the broad shoulders, the long arms, with the bonnet on his brow gay with sprigs of heather on which the dew was still wet, with the long folds of the kilt falling into new shapes at every movement of the supple limbs. Health and strength and Highland air and 18. If anybody could not be content with these, he would be hard to satisfy. Yes, but there is something wanting still. Such a glorious young lover needs a mate. It all depends upon circumstances whether the reader will believe that at the distant glimpse of a gown, the sunshine became at least 20 times more bright and beautiful, that the mavis and the merle and the throstle and a host of other choristers all began to sing away as if for dear life, almost choking their delicate little throats in their wild and ecstatic hurry to pour out the largest possible number of notes in the smallest possible number of minutes, that the waterfall suddenly glowed with a kaleidoscopic iridescence of exuberant colour, compared to which 100 double rainbows would have seemed like a dull cloak of hodden grey, that there went rushing through the boy's veins a torrent of passion to which Niagara is Dutch, and that then his soul reached a serene elevation to which the top of Chimborazo is the bottom of a coal pit. Yes, if the reader has ever been deliciously mad, he, for we must not talk of she, will understand all this. Yes, he knows that it is impossible to grow extravagant or hyperbolical about that young lady. Poor Donald Grant. Mary Horton was not a young lady. No, but she was very beautiful, and looked all the more so perchance because her beauty was so different from his own. The subtlest harmonies, whether of sight or sound, are those that spring from contrast. The lad was handsome, with the ruddy colour of the north. His long hair was golden, but with a glow in it warmer than that of gold. The girl, again, had the dark tresses, the deep eyes, eloquent, fiery, intense, of the south. His was the grace, the beauty of aggression. Hers, as passionate as his, seemed pleading and submissive. As he stooped down, so that they looked each other fairly in the face, he seemed like some Norse rover who had travelled, let us say, in Spain, and did not intend to return to Norway alone. Their eyes met. They told each other so much more than the few stammering words of greeting, that the girl turned her head aside, trembling a little at the eager glance which seemed to devour her secret with an almost cruel triumph. She was not a lady, as we have said. She was the orphan daughter of very poor people. She was, melancholy fact must be admitted, only a lady's maid. A clever girl was Mary Horton, too romantic, no doubt, had chiefly nourished her brain upon novels, and saw in Donald as fine a young hero as any Reginald de Courcy or Alured de Bohun who had ever, for love's sake, married a damsel of low degree. Poor little girl! With such splendid possibilities in her, with such eyes, such a voice, she was not over safe in a world where men are selfish often in the very degree of their passion. She knew this too, in a dim way, and her dreams were often sorely troubled when the ladies whom she served had dismissed her for the night. Were these novels true, that she had read so eagerly? She hoped they might be. But she could hardly hope that the gentleman would be true to her. Besides, was she fit for him, fit to be his wife? There again, poor little Mary, knowing her own deficiencies, felt herself very helpless and forlorn. It is lucky for girls that they can cry. And yet she was safe enough with Donald Grant. Had that young gentleman been able to do so, which he was not, he would then and there have married her offhand. Would the union have been a happy one after all? Well, there would probably have been troubles and difficulties and sorrows, which their young heads had never thought of. Meanwhile, it was very sweet to be thus alone together. 2 hours after this, an observant and intelligent Scottish man of the menial persuasion received from Captain Grant 2 things. Number 1, a guinea for valuable information. Number 2, a kick for having played the spy. He accepted both with serene imperturbability. No one in the captain's house had a pleasant time of it that day, and at dinner Donald could see that something had crossed his father, whilst the father could see that his son was ill at ease. The captain suffered least, for his morality, after all, was little more than the conventional code of honour prevalent amongst men of the world, whereas the poor lad was horribly in earnest. Nay, if we were to anatomise the old campaigner's feelings very deeply, we might discover that the amourette, for he could not believe that it was anything more serious, really vexed him very little, Boys would be boys. This girl, who was said to be so pretty, must be easily got out of the way, and so on, and so on. Wronging all the while two people, one of whom was inexpressibly dear to him, and both of whom were pure. Perhaps, thought he, it was not worth while to open the campaign in force. He would get Donald out of this dangerous neighbourhood, of course. Calf love was not at all unnatural, and did not usually last very long. Thus mused the old campaigner, and on the whole resolved not to commence the attack just yet, but to remain within his trenches. Imagine the veteran's dismay when, of a sudden, the enemy dashed into his lines. I want to speak to you, sir, very seriously, quoth the audacious Donald. The shock was over, the surprise was over. It had been a severe one, and the captain was annoyed to find that in the confusion of the attack he had absolutely spilled a glass of claret. But now he was on his guard, and a great deal cooler than the assailant. The rebel force was evidently embarrassed. There was plenty of pluck about it, but very little discipline. In fact, it at once endeavoured to deprive the inevitable conflict of its most sanguinary features. "You have always been a very good father to me, sir," cries Rebel, not at all in a determined manner. "Well, my dear boy, I hope so," answers British veteran, seeing his advantage, and quietly massing his forces against the weakest point of the enemy's line. "I hope so, Donald. Surely that's not the very serious business." "No, sir, but, you know, sir, I'm past 18. "Delightful age," replies the captain, "and really, paternal vanity apart, Donald, I never met with a finer young gentleman at that period of life. Come, my boy, out with it. It can hardly be very serious after all, I fancy. Not likely to prevent you from trying the deep pool with me tomorrow morning, eh?" By this admirable strategic manoeuvre, the great tactician indicated, without ostentatiously announcing, his knowledge of the enemy's movements. "Indeed, sir, it is very serious." Now, Donald had carefully rehearsed a clever speech, and had Donald's father committed the enormous mistake of being angry, that speech would doubtless have been delivered. But as matters befell, Donald, not without an unpleasant suspicion that he was rather mismanaging a case which had seemed delightfully clear early in the day, could only stammer forth, "The fact is, sir, I'm in love." And, to his utter discomfiture, replied the captain, "My dear, dear boy, do you think I didn't know that already?" There was nothing for it now but a plain confession, and a plain confession it was, which the father heard with a growing pain as the son went on with the growing earnestness. But then the captain changed his tactics, and fought sternly. The danger was more serious than he had thought, and, as his last word, he uttered an absolute and peremptory "No." "God help me, then," cried the lad. "I must do my duty. Indeed, sir, if you could only see her, if you could only know how good she is." "Be good enough, Donald, to remember that you are talking to a gentleman, and that I can't go to look for my son's wife in a servants' hall. I deal with you plainly. I will not have the thing spoken of again, Donald. It must cease, sir, now and forever." And here the battle ended, for, with a stormy sob, the boy rose from his seat and left the room. He was miserable enough, but he was not half so miserable as his father, who still sat at the table, with strange pangs torturing him, and a dreary fear of the future at his heart. This boy whom he so loved, of whom he was so passionately proud, this boy to fling away the prospects of a life for a pair of black eyes? He would not have it, and yet how nervously he shrank from another unkind word. Then, when it grew late, he went sorrowfully to his son's room. The boy was asleep, but sleeping uneasily, and at times indistinctly muttering words whose meaning the captain fancied he could guess. Then the captain's heart yearned again towards his son. And as, after he had silently and solemnly blessed him, he prepared to go, a gentle smile passed over the boy's face. He woke, and saw his father beside him. Then first, ere he was quite conscious, he lovingly held out his hand for the familiar farewell clasp, and then remembering, turned away his head, crying bitterly. But not so bitterly as his father, who, cut to the very heart by the sight of this sorrow, bent over the boy's bed and kissed him, so that their tears mingled, and their souls too, and besought him, in the broken tones which are so terrible to hear when a grown man utters them, to be wiser. And what he could not have done by mere persuasion, nor by mere exercise of will, he did by this great grief of his, and though the lad groaned as he gave his promise, He promised that he would in all things obey his father as before. Then there was peace between father and son. But after a civil war you don't find people settling down quietly to their old avocations. The old order can't be restored by a proclamation. The struggle has left wounds that throb and rankle, heart-burnings which cannot be stilled. When the two next met, there was a difference in their bearing. The old entire and utter confidence and love were gone. In its stead, there were other feelings, stronger and more intense, but less pure, less spontaneous. Each knew that this change had come over their relationship. Each was angry with himself, grieved at the other. Each was determined not to show this embarrassment, and hence both, much against their will and wish, were really awkward, talkative at the wrong season, silent at inconvenient moments. Donald had given his promise, and never dreamt of breaking it, but there was a wild tempest of passion raging within him, and storming against his resolution. You can hardly expect 18 to sacrifice its first dream without something in the nature of an explosion. Now, young love is generally selfish, but let us do the boy the justice to own that so far as he knew, he was angry and wild simply because he had promised to abandon her. What seemed his grievance was the thought of the sorrow she would have to go through. She went through it very well. Women fret themselves abundantly over imaginary sorrows, give them a real grief, inflict upon them an actual pain, and they bear it much better than the Lord of creation, who is rather given to cry out in a lordly way when his pangs become acute. There was one more meeting between the lovers, whereof the captain had full cognizance, for the son was morally a prisoner on parole, and he was a gentleman. And at this meeting, with many tears, many sobs, with wild, fiery glances of passion and unutterable murmurs of regret, the two gave up their dream. It was in the evening that they met, and at the old trysting place, but the brightness of Glenorchy was gone. Sorrowfully they parted, and as each went homeward, the solemn mists of the night rose in the valley, and hung heavily about the mountain range. Slowly they walked away, nor for some time could either bear to look round, but at length Donald, turning, saw the girl dimly and obscurely fading into the mist, and wandering alone up the gloomy valley into the great darkness that lay beyond, and a chill touched his blood, and a dreary vision of long separation, of tender yearnings for reunion never to be fulfilled, a vision of a life barren and purposeless henceforth, passed before him. Querulously seemed the river to mourn as he walked along, and still the mists thickened. He reached home. His father waited for him with a stern anxiety, in the fear that his last interview might have led the boy into forgetfulness of his promise. But in the forced gaiety of the sun, in the strange light which gleamed from his large eyes, aye, and worse than this, in a tone of polite submission which he had never heard before from Donald's lips, the captain knew that it was all over, that for good or evil the trial had been undergone, and that the youngster had passed sentence upon his folly. For good or for evil? Could there be any doubt of it? Of course it was for good. And now Donald must leave the place, must see something more of the world, must have something to keep his mind from brooding over his grief. They would go to London. They would see the great city together. His own knowledge and experience would keep Donald free from many dangers. The boy acquiesced with a gallant air of cheerfulness, which did not deceive his father, and then, filling a huge glass, drank as a toast, laughingly, "Goodbye to Glenorchy!" Yes, goodbye to Glenorchy, and to all the old happy life, to the morning plunge in the burn, to the midday rest on the moorland. Goodbye to the old peacefulness, the old perfect trust. Father and son had been one, and were two. That was all. Except indeed that poor little Mary Horton's heart seemed breaking when this cruel, cruel end came to her poor romance. London had upon Donald Grant the effect which London frequently has upon young gentlemen who have warm blood in their veins and a touch of fire in their nature. London first repelled him, then attracted him, then satiated him, then wearied him, and as he went through these various phases and conditions in the order named, he naturally got a good deal altered from the lad who was ready to sacrifice all for love, except his duty to his father. He had often seen the sun rise in the Highlands. He got to be familiar with the rising of that luminary in London, the difference being merely this, that he himself in the Highlands used also to rise, and that in London he had not been to bed. Babylon has many cunning lures and artfully meshed nets. She catches young folks in her toils very easily. But it is not only young folks that she catches. Captain Grant was to have guided his son, but who was to guide Captain Grant? We shall see, by and by, how it went with him. Meanwhile, this at least was certain, that his boy was no longer a boy, that he had grown into a man, and a man who was not happy. No, when the London fever began to run into its later stages, Donald had a profound contempt for his own weakness. He had wasted much and learned little. His heart was growing weary. He had tried to fill it with poor semblances of love, to no purpose. Although the affection for his father had not become weaker, it had undergone a change. It was a sad time for Donald, when he began to see that his father, after all, had faults and errors, which were not all of them of the generous kind so readily pardoned in youth, and so seldom repeated in age. The town life palled upon our young Scot, who tired of wasting his years in a dull round. Society bored him, and when he went into the wilderness to kick up his heels, he found that Bohemia was quite as tiresome as society. What to do? At any rate, to get away, to travel, to work, to fight, to live a life with some real excitement about it. Captain Grant, on his part, could not but feel that it was he who had changed the boy, and he could not cheat himself into the belief that the change was really for the better. After all, had he blundered? He could not believe that. He had kept Donald from disgracing himself by a marriage with one so far below him socially as Mary Horton. But he was fain to remember that there were other bonds of disgrace, and that if his son was now more worldly wise, he had purchased a knowledge which did not seem to make him any happier at the expense of much nobler qualities. Somewhat tarnished was this bright boy of his. Some of the London atmosphere had got into his lungs, let us say, and he did not breathe so freely. Their house grew to be a rather sad one, and at length both felt that they would be better apart. Never an angry word passed, or could pass, between them, but there were now reserves and suppressions which were perhaps worse than positive quarrels. The captain was almost relieved, after all, when he knew that his son was willing to go to India. The son was glad when he got a commission. End of section 12. Recording by Squeaky. Section 13 of A Bunch of Keys, Where They Were Found and What They Might Have Unlocked, a Christmas book edited by Tom Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Key of the Study, Part 2, by W.J. Prowse. And Mary Horton? She too was in London, but she had been obliged to leave her employment, for the captain who could pity his son had no pity for her. There were young men in the family that she served who might, said the captain to her mistress, be deluded as Donald had been. Then when they had removed to London, they dismissed her, not unkindly, but plainly stating why. They offered her a sum of money beyond her wages, and the poor girl had to take it, though her spirit rose against the offer. She must maintain herself. She could not leave her employer's home penniless. So with a heart that was on fire with anger, she thanked them. What harm had she done, she thought. Was it her fault if Donald had loved her, and then, at a word from his father, forsaken her in her need? It was cruel, it was base, it was a shame. And then the current of her thought would change, and she would cry to herself that Donald was right. She was not fit for him. He would have had to blush for her among his friends, and she could not bear to think that Donald, so proud as he was too, should have to blush. No, it was all for the best, and as for her, she must provide for herself elsewhere. She lost the greater part of her money very soon. Employment offices and dishonest advertisers were as plentiful then as now, and this poor girl was easily swindled. And as she drew to the end of her resources, she fell ill, and first her pride would not allow her to send for help to her former mistress, who would have aided her, and then the fever and excitement of her brain told upon her, and she grew much worse. When the poor are kind to the poor, they are very kind indeed, but it is a stupid cant of the day to claim, for all the poor, virtues which are not confined to any one class, thank God. Sometimes the poor are cruel, and Mary Horton's landlady happened to be one of these. Then a young girl who had seen her in her illness took compassion on her, and she was moved to a hospital. Delirium came on, and went away, and she was left there, a poor forlorn waif. She was very pretty, and she was destitute when she left the hospital. Over this part of her life let us pass, if you please, as swiftly and gently as possible. It was very short and horrible. Donald, meanwhile, knew nothing of all this. Nay, his father had not scrupled to deceive him in such sort that he thought Mary fickle, or at any rate forgetful, and then struggled to forget himself. It would have been better for them both had the truth been known. The captain had ventured to play Providence, but his scheme was turning out very ill, so that these two things happened on one and the same day. Captain Grant received a commission for his son, and going to his room found the gallant officer of the future huddled up on his bed with his boots on, and with evident signs of disorder and debauch upon his countenance. Thus far was he improved by life under the auspices of his prudent father. Mary Horton left the hospital. Thus had her destiny been shaped by a man not naturally unkind, but wilful and headstrong in his own conceit. And for the captain himself, years seemed to have come upon him very suddenly. He grew old before his time. He was weary and tired, and sorrow-stricken and worn out. Thus, to sum up, 3 people began a new life at the same time. Donald Grant, who sailed away to India; Mary Horton, who once vanished into a Highland mist and vanished now into a London fog; Captain Grant, who found his chief hope blighted, and had to console himself as best he might. There is no room here to deal with particulars. You may elaborate every detail of an hour. When you have to do with years, you have to summarize, often imperfectly, often erroneously. Of the 3 folk with whom we are concerned, the compte rendu must be brief and hasty, and then we bring them again upon the scene, as another climax, another crisis may demand. The young soldier went away. The chief sense in his heart was a desire for change. He had tried London, and it had tired him. Away in the east, after passing through the usual stage of griffinhood, he got to take an interest in his work. The fellow would be indeed a dull one who, in the first flush of manhood, could find himself set in authority over grave and bearded oriental gentlemen, without a kind of feeling that herein, in this great trust, was involved as great a duty. Boggles, who flukes from Eton into epaulets, may forget this thing. To young Grant, the old clan feeling stood instead of any definite reflection on the subject. He accepted his regiment as, in some sort, his tribe, loved his work, and did it well. The number of Britons, however, who do their duty well is, thank God, so large that this would have done him little good in re promotion, though much as regards his own moral growth and development. But there came stirring times at last, and he got his chance. He was known in his regiment as a man passionately fond of field sports and of the big game, also as a man who read much, also as a man who seemed to be very old for his age. He stuck to his duties, never kept aloof from whatever social fun might be going on in his station or cantonment, but he was hardly popular. In honest truth, 2 remorses at least weighed upon him. He felt as if he had injured, disappointed, wounded his father, and as if, to sum the whole affair up quickly, he had been very fickle and shamefully feeble in his conduct towards the poor little girl whom he still loved. The look of Donald Grant was a good deal changed. The florid face had been baked by India into a ruddy brown. Long moustaches curled over his lips, and there were dark circles under his eyes and stern lines on his forehead. He did well in his profession, rose to places of trust. Of a sudden there came upon India a dead calm, an awful silence. Throughout the land there was at once an apparent quiescence and a marvellous activity, a nervous, electrical vivacity. Men who could read the signs of the times, who could look out boldly and with clear vision toward the political horizon, saw a great cloud gathering slowly. The vague sense of an unseen danger, the mysterious foreboding of an unknown peril filled their souls. And at last the storm burst. Some day or another a poet-historian will write a grand record of English resistance. It was superb, it was kingly, it was worthy of a race destined to rule the earth. Little blonde ensigns charged, with their white teeth clenched, and their puny fists doubled right into thousands. Grim old bearded colonels awoke to chivalry. Civilians vied with soldiers in gallant endurance, and the ladies, God bless them, so far from troubling this free heroic spirit, breathed into it a great passion and fire. In that struggle, Donald Grant was fortunate enough to have a chance or 2. His own regiment turned against him, would not take his life, but stormily marched away to help their kinsmen. He was one of the few officers whom they spared. Soon after, he reached an outlying station that was besieged by the rebels. Provisions ran short in the fort. Privations and bullets removed the majority of the English leaders. Grant, one day, by this time a lieutenant, saw that the only chance left, and it was desperate, lay in a sortie. On a Sunday, the chaplain, whose own physical strength was fast failing him, but whose courage never faltered, administered the sacrament to the faithful little company who were beleaguered. On the Monday the sortie was made, and when the odds seemed heavily against the English, there was a sudden wavering in the enemy's line, and a cloud of dust far away. Later, there came a ringing cheer in the jolly, manly tone of our race. The station was saved, and Grant, with a great sword gash on his face, heard, as he fainted, a loud cry of victory. Then the women gathered round him, nursing. He soon recovered. In days like those, a man's superb vital force and pluck enable him to bear up against wounds very readily. He fails only when the excitement is over and the reaction has set in. Recovering, he gained fresh honours, and when the Great Mutiny had been trodden underfoot by Colin Campbell, he came home. If his life had for many years hung heavily upon his hands, and had only become tolerable when at length a great national crisis gave him a chance, judge how the years had passed at home with Mary. After a very short and terrible period, she had found friends, and worked from that time in many ways, all hard enough, but all honest. By degrees, she drifted towards the theatre. She was very handsome, though with a beauty that would rather awe than attract. She had admirers, of course, but she was quite indifferent to their admiration. Nay, she had suffered so horribly that her temper had grown fierce and resentful. She could not look upon her life with resignation. She regarded it with intense and disdainful anger. She despised herself even more than she despised others. Yet there were some of her friends to whom she was different in her bearing, and one of those was a man older than herself, one John Lane, who watched over her with a kind of canine fidelity. He was merely a violin player in an orchestra, but he had a little money from other sources, amongst other things from lessons. He was shrewd, kindly, a little selfish. When Mary, after many tentatives in other directions, tried the stage, John Lane saw that her ultimate success was certain. He set himself to work for her, rendered her many services, made himself necessary to her, and won, at least, her gratitude and affection. When he asked her to marry him, which at length he did, Mary was frank and honest in reply, told him of her hideous troubles, and also of the love which preceded them, owned that her heart was untouched by him in the way that a woman's should be by the man who seeks her for a wife, but, for the rest, confessed that she liked him very much, was grateful to him. Briefly, would marry him if, knowing all this, he still persevered. John Lane pressed his suit. They were married very quietly. Nor were they altogether unhappy. Love on his part, cordial liking and gratitude on hers, were the elements of a tolerably peaceful married life. But her heart was still hungry. John Lane was a good husband, no doubt, and she was true and good to him, but her life seemed a waste. At length, John, after infinite diplomacy, so succeeded that Mary was engaged at a leading London theatre. This engagement was to her what the Indian Mutiny was to Grant. It called forth her full capacity, gave her something about which she could be in earnest. Before long she was recognized. With her stern beauty, sombre and passionate, she swayed the hearts of her audience more potently than by winning graces and pleasant smiles, on which most of her rivals depended. As she swept across the stage, you trembled, for in her eyes there was a light which was terrible, and the voice, resonant and musical though it was, could also give such point to a sneer, such hideous emphasis to a sarcasm, such rage of expression to invective, that involuntarily you shuddered, as before a woman who had some private grief, some private wrong, some misery upon which she brooded, and which tortured her very soul. And now for the third life, for this, after all, was the saddest. Grant's father, as we said, tried to guide Grant, but who could guide Grant's father? The captain missed his boy very much. The relations had grown somewhat cold and embarrassing, but when Donald was absolutely gone, the captain's love seemed to redouble. All their awkwardness, their petty troubles, went out of the captain's mind. He could only think of the finest qualities of the lad, forgot the sorry way in which Donald had yielded to London, and simply recollected the Highland time. They had lived so long together that the house was horribly lonely without Donald. Then his letters, when they came, were certainly affectionate, but to the father it seemed as though they were marked by a certain restraint, as if their very affection were hardly free and natural, but rather a mere matter of duty. All this pained him bitterly. What had he done? He had kept Donald from sacrificing his prospects in life, had saved him from a ridiculous marriage. Yes, this was true, but at what cost? Was Donald, no matter what his prospects, at all happy or contented? The captain knew that he was not, and so there preyed upon him this double regret, that he had lost some portion of his son's affection, and that he had not succeeded in his plans for his son's good. He left London now and then for Scotland, but it was dreary and sad to tramp about with his keepers, and without Donald. All their favourite haunts, bridges, ledges of rock, and so forth, only reminded him of his loss. Then he grew gloomy, and drank. By and by field sports had no longer any charm for him, and his life grew to be without an object. No doubt Donald would return some time or other, but it would not be the same Donald. He wanted him back, and yet feared to see him. It would be sweet to go down to the old spots with him if the lad had not changed. Letters came frequently enough, but they were not very long ones, nor so cordial as those of a son should be, and the father winced as he saw that Donald was growing worldly wise after his fashion, and that the fashion was not a good one. He had failed, obviously made a bungle of his interference. These thoughts haunted him perpetually, and he grew to be very wretched. A lonely man, getting old too. What use was he to anybody, even to himself? He had money, but there were things which it could not buy him. "A useless old stager, sir," would the captain say to his few intimates. Nor were his associates of the best kind. He disliked now those quiet English drawing-rooms to which he used to introduce Donald so proudly. The sight of that kind of domestic happiness hurt him. He saw parents who certainly could not love their children more than he, surrounded by grown-up sons who were taking their place in the world and doing credit to their names. So was Donald too, no doubt. He was a capital soldier, of course. All the Grants would be that. But he was buried in India, and the old man's heart was fierce and angry, and yet torn by a wild craving to see his son again, to live the good old life once more. How could he bear this misery, he asked himself. How could anyone bear it, lonely, wretched old man? He would go no more into houses where he saw such happiness, which was given so readily to other people, denied so cruelly to him. Few people, who saw him walking quietly to his club, guessed what a furnace of passion was burning within him. With what wild cries at night time he woke, shouting for Donald, or how he hated the house his son had left. Long hours he would sit in the study, brooding over this curse that had seemed to come upon him, until he could not bear to sit alone any more. He went about amongst men to whom his nature would have been unintelligible, calm, cynical men of the world, with their affections very much under their own control. He needed excitement, and he found it where such a man was likely to seek it, at the gaming table. He cared little for money lost or won. What he needed was the morbid emotion of the gambler. This he got, and then steadily went downhill, drifting on to a miserable old age, losing his own self-respect, and only happy sometimes in dreams. The most reckless successes are not those of youth. They are those committed by men who, after living reputably for many years, break loose again. Sailing homeward, Donald Grant had many bad dreams, but he never fancied that there would be any very great change in his father. The stormy life he had led had somewhat tired him. The struggle was superb while it lasted. Now that it was over, and his nerves were no longer at full tension, the chief desire of his soul was rest. He had lived at high pressure, but there is a time for all things. As he paced the deck of an evening, and watched the glory of the sunset, thoughts of the old home rushed in upon him, so that he yearned to see his father, and then to go back into Scotland with him, and wander about arm in arm. He had seen grander mountains than Cruachan, but he wanted now to watch the curl of the clouds around the old hill. Glenorchy would seem very small after the great gorges of the Himalayas, and there was the memory about it of a deep sorrow. Still, he would like to gaze again into Salmon Pool, and see the mountain ashes once more, and as for his disappointment, that, as he supposed, could give him no further pain. Just one twinge, perchance, like the aching of an old wound, might he suffer when he came to the spot where he parted with Mary. But it was very long ago. Doubtless she was married by this time. If not, did it greatly matter? He had gone away a boy, he was coming back a man. Yet there leapt up in his heart the spirit of boyhood, eager and exultant as he thought of the long, long days that he would pass with his father. Of course, father would be old, hardly able to do much in the way of deer-stalking. Well, perhaps that too was all the better. Grant bethought himself how his father used to lift him in his arms when he tired, how he took him to all the loveliest nooks about the country. Well, this would be changed now. It would be his turn to guide and support, and with a very tender love he thanked God that he had been spared in battle and saved from disease, to go home to his father thus and comfort him. The captain knew that his boy was coming back, but Donald had started earlier than he first intended, and would himself bring the first news of his actual return. The old man winced as he thought of the meeting. He looked in the glass, saw his wrinkles, but saw also that he had not been altered merely by time. He grew very miserable and ashamed. That he should have to meet his son thus, to be afraid of him. It was a bad ending to a life, this. He had made a very wretched business of it after all. He was grey, but venerable? What? That man who slinks into a gambling house and watches the turn of the game with eyes bloodshot and bleared, who is almost the mockery of younger players, the pity of a few men of his own time. He could hardly call him venerable. Could he not break away from all this and make himself a little worthier of his son, whose name had figured with honour in Outram's own dispatches? No, it was too late, or else he was too feeble. Still, would Donald but come and love him a little better than he feared, they might go away together, away from this horrible city that had so profaned and polluted both of them, back to the old house. Father and son both had the same simple plan of life, but it was all in the future. And now, just now, until Donald came, the captain could not do much by himself. Besides, and this was the dreariest thought, this it was which brought tears, childish tears, to his eyes, Donald might be shocked at his utter wreck, might find it hard to love him in the old way. The poor man's nerve was gone, and there was only one means now by which he could ever rouse himself to action, even to action that did but bring nearer the bad, bad end. As Donald hurried on, finding steam itself slow, so great grew his impatience. A strange morbid restlessness possessed him, a nervous irritability. He was petulant with his own servants, moody and reserved with his fellow passengers. There is little time wasted by the overland route, but the hours seemed to grow horribly long. He could do nothing to get on faster, and this sense of impotence, absurd though he felt it to be, annoyed him. He slept little, and never woke refreshed. Nay, to the doctors it seemed as though he were lashing himself into a state of fever, and one man cautioned him, but got scanty thanks for the warning. Marseille at last, and the train thundered along across France too slowly for his haste. His overwrought brain seemed to pant and throb with every beat of the engines, and with his head thrust out of the window, facing the rush of the wind, he could have shouted to the very stokers and sworn at them for making no more speed. And now, on a foggy day, he crossed the Channel, peering out through the mist for the first English light, and then again the train thundered, and again his brain panted and throbbed. It was a dull November evening when he reached London, and the place seemed hatefully squalid to him as he drove home to his father's house. Any noise seemed to drive him mad. The very rattle of his cab wheels worried him. The captain was not at home. It was uncertain when he would return, the servant said. He might be late. He was sometimes late. Wouldn't the gentleman call again? Oh, it was Mr. Donald! Yes! Would Mr. Donald wait? It was hard to have hurried as he had, and get this for his welcome, but a real disappointment troubled him less than his merely fantastic miseries. Nay, now that he had got home, and the life of his dreams could not be many hours from him, he was almost pleased that a little time longer was left. He walked out into the streets, laughing at himself. How ridiculous had been his impatience! What a cross-grained, evil-tempered wretch he had been on the journey. Well, it was all right now. He had but to kill a few hours. His father might be late. And Donald thought of the old man again, fancied him at his club, smoking his honest cigar with some other old Indians, talking about himself very likely. A grey-haired man, but handsome still and courtly, proud of his son too. What a life they would have! How to pass the time? He would not hunt for his father. He did not want strangers at that meeting. He strolled into a theatre, the first he passed, and for a time the figures on the stage were mere puppets, scarcely visible, indeed, for his own drama was what he thought about, and he sat there indolently, with half-shut eyes, and twitched now and then his yellow beard, and played with his long moustaches idly. But at length a sudden burst of applause roused him from his reverie. The great actress of the night entered. A strange, wild thrill went through him like a sword thrust as he saw her. The look of the man changed at once as he rose in his stall, erect and eager, careless of the cry to sit down, and waited until she spoke. It was her voice, richer and fuller, but hers. And then, as with a superb gesture she turned and saw him, and with a spasm she seemed for just 1 second to reel upon the stage as though she would fall, then, conquering her pain by her courage, magnificently declaimed. But she never looked that way again all night. And when Lane carried her home, she fell with a pitiful moan upon the floor, and would not rise. Could she but faint? No. Consciousness, fiery, intense, never left her for a moment. The whole love of Donald's heart had yearned towards her again. The passion long suppressed had rebelled and triumphed, and in the hour when it arose, he learnt that it was hopeless, that Mary was married. How brave she was! How gloriously she had borne herself in that fierce momentary ordeal! Then there came a great bitterness in Grant's soul, a recollection almost angry of their old love, almost wrathful of his father's conduct. He shuddered at his own evil thoughts. But he could not yet go home, not yet for a little while. Moodily he walked about the streets. He had not known what a place that love of his yet held in his heart. Still there was much left to live for, and solemnly he blessed his father, to whom he would say no word that should arouse the recollection of their one dispute. He turned homewards, and then came the pang, then came the culminating agony, for as he approached the house, he passed an old man who was staggering unsteadily, and as he turned aside to avoid him, their eyes met. They had wept together. Their love had survived sorrow, even shame. Donald was in bed, stupid and insensible, neither waking nor asleep. The old man sat alone in the study. His head rested between his hands, but when he raised it a little, there was on it an awful look of wistful sorrow and a strange, pitiful bewilderment. His nerves were shattered. Nerves? Why, his very heart was crushed. He tried to plot and think, but the blood rushed to his temples, and his head seemed as though it would burst. After a time he pulled his writing-case towards him. His hand shook, for many reasons, but with his faltering fingers he scrawled a few lines, idly repeating words. My dear, dear boy, after a little while I shall be better, and we will see each other again, and live very happily, but I cannot face you for a day or two. How the dull pain grew! But not yet, Donald, dear. Do not blame me when you read this. But tonight I am going away. The pain was worse. He must bathe his temples before he could end the letter. He rose from his chair, then fell heavily forward on the table, muttering "Donald" still, as the blood trickled to the desk, staining it, and then he did not mutter any more. Tonight I am going away, he had written, and now indeed he had gone. End of section 13. Recording by Squeaky.
Section 14 of A Bunch of Keys, Where They Were Found and What They Might Have Unlocked. A Christmas Book, edited by Tom Hood. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kate Follis. 3 Keys on a Small Ring of Their Own by C. W. Scott. Chapter 1. The Key of the Dressing Room. When Mr. Everest announced one morning with as grave a face as he could put on for the occasion that Aunt Rachel had decided to come and live at Riverside, a very serious discussion ensued. They had all expected it for some time past, and though Edith Everest entirely agreed with her father in the course he had thought fit to adopt, she, quite as much as her little sister Mabel, secretly hoped that the evil day would somehow or other be averted. And indeed it was a horrid shame, as Mabel expressed it, to have to introduce an element of discord into that peaceable and unusually happy family circle. Mrs. Everest had died soon after the birth of Mabel, the youngest girl, and ever since then the father and his 2 daughters had lived together more like brothers and sisters than anything else. The house in which they resided was charmingly situated in the heart of the very loveliest part of the Thames scenery, and Mr. Everest invariably found it no easy task to tear his pretty nymphs away from their river home just when the water lilies were beginning to unfold themselves and the forget-me-nots to bloom, in order to respond to the authoritative summons of the fashionable world and see the roses on their cheeks fade under the influences of glare and gaslight, late hours in London ballrooms. Mr. Everest was a very wealthy London merchant, and though of course he could have lived on a far grander scale than he did at Mapledurham, he was not at all anxious to take any step which his children would have objected to, and indeed would himself have thought it a great hardship to be compelled to leave the dear old home. Each year slipped away merrily enough, but there was one fact which seemed entirely to have been passed over or forgotten at Riverside. Edith Everest was no longer a child, but had suddenly bloomed into a tall and singularly handsome young woman. No wonder, then, that Aunt Rachel shuddered when she heard that her beautiful niece was running about wild in the country, and suddenly became painfully alive to the fact that there was no one at hand to form the poor child's character, as she called it, or to guide her safely through the intricate paths which wind round that great institution styled Vanity Fair. Mrs. Richardson, or Aunt Rachel, was a widow of about 5 or 6 and 50, and a very great person in her own estimation. She was certainly of the world worldly, and though of good but certainly by no means distinguished family, set up a God-called aristocracy, and worshipped it, and was continually parading her hackneyed platitudes about birth, family, and gentle blood. Her manner no one could find fault with, and her address was very ladylike, though perhaps rather overstudied, and she had the good sense so to control her temper, which was not of the sweetest, as to reserve the worst of it entirely for those immediately and closely connected with her. On the death of her husband, she came into a very large property, both in land and money, of which last article she certainly was not prodigal, for indeed there were people unkind enough to declare that the worthy lady was not only a sparing woman, but what they could not help calling a close-fisted one. The generous offer, then, of her services in Edith Everest's behalf was not so disinterested as it might have appeared at first sight, since on being installed in her brother's comfortable mansion in Hyde Park Gardens during the approaching season, it was quite possible both to forget and forego the cares and expense of her own establishment at Rutland Gate. Be that as it may, though both Mr. Everest and Edith were perfectly aware that Aunt Rachel was a necessary evil, they determined to do their best to make everything smooth for her when she arrived, and made up their minds to enjoy thoroughly the last little bit of peace and quiet that was left them at Riverside before the time came for their departure for town, when Aunt Rachel was really to arrive, and Edith was to be introduced into the very best society, and Mabel was to go through a course of governesses and fashionable masters. That last happy month passed too quickly for all of them, and long before it was wanted came the day which had been fixed for their departure. Mabel took her last peep at the swan's nest, hidden by the rushes in the stream. Edith made her last sketch of the pretty house, now almost lost among the fresh green trees, and they all walked for the last time in the woods newly carpeted with primroses and sweet with the early violets. And then came the sound of carriage wheels and the lumbering of trunks, and an inevitable farewell to dear old Riverside. It was some consolation to them all that Aunt Rachel altered her plans so far as coming down into the country was concerned, but when the Everests arrived at Hyde Park Gardens, they found her fully installed, and she received them most graciously. Seeing that Edith Everest was a very lovable as well as an unusually beautiful girl, and when to these charms was added the fact that she was likely to be a very rich heiress, it may reasonably cause some surprise that she found herself at the age of 20 with her heart still in her own possession. Strange to say, there had really been no lovers. But then Edith was not quite like the ordinary run of young ladies, who, when similarly gifted, seldom conduct themselves in as sensible a manner. To begin with, she despised anything like a flirtation, and, what is more, showed as decidedly as her sweet and gentle nature would permit how much she despised it to those who ever attempted this dangerous, but at the same time very enjoyable, amusement. It was quite evident that love with her would be a great absorbing passion, and it was equally certain that she could never teach herself to love. Those who knew her best felt that her heart, when once gained, would be a prize almost beyond all price. Besides, she was too happy with her father and sister to think of tearing herself away from them, and too contented with her present position to dream of throwing herself in love's way. There was a cousin, certainly, one Arthur Oldham, of whom she was excessively fond. It would have been a difficult matter to define the kind of love she felt for him. It was somehow stronger than a sister's love, but it seemed to stop short of the actual reality. They had been brought up together ever since they were children, and many were the delightful days they spent together when Arthur was a little manly fellow, glowing with all the pride and gentlemanliness of a full-blown public school boy, and Edith revelling in the glories of short frocks and mischief. And after that Arthur went to Oxford, and insisted upon spending nearly all the vac at Riverside, and then the time slipped away again, and he found himself in chambers at the Temple, pretending to read hard at law, but really writing leading articles and papers for magazines, and constantly running away from Saturday to Monday to the house down by the river, where he always received the warmest of welcomes, till he came to be considered quite a member of the family. In fact, he was ever called away by one low voice to one dear neighborhood, and often in his walks with Edith claimed a distant kinship to the gracious blood, that shook the heart of Edith hearing him. There was no doubt whatever about his love for Edith Everest, and he very frequently reflected that he was not altogether behaving well in putting himself so far in a false position, and in continually plunging further and further into the wood. But the poor fellow could not help it. He knew perfectly well that he ought to have gone abroad, and taught himself to forget all about the girl that was so near, and yet so far, from him. But then, like many of us, he had not the moral courage to carry his honest thoughts into execution, and so they wandered hour by hour, gathered the blossom that rebloomed, and drank the magic cup that filled itself anew. Edith Everest had not been in London 6 weeks before she was really in love. Her father was naturally rather proud of his beautiful daughter, and he used to be very fond of taking a stroll after church on Sunday afternoons, just to see the fine folks in the park. Edith invariably went with him. It was a duty walk at first with her, as she never hesitated to say that she strongly objected to the absurd custom, as she used to call it, of parading up and down to look and be looked at. It was not long, however, before she looked forward to those Sunday walks with feverish excitement. Times had changed with her. The whole course and purpose of her life was somehow altered, and all through the day there was one face that haunted her. Why was it that her heart beat so quickly, and that her hand almost trembled in her father's arm on one of those eventful Sundays? There had been no bow, no recognition, no one had spoken to her, but still she knew as well as possible there was one face in the crowd she had seen before, and more than that, she felt that its influence was very great indeed. Again their eyes met. Again a thrill of excitement seemed to rush through all her veins, and again she moved on with the crowd, and all seemed darkness. Now she remembered it all. She had been staying in Gloucestershire the year before, and during her visit had taken the well-known trip from Bristol to Chepstow, and so along the babbling Wye to lovely Tintern Abbey, not forgetting a peep from the Wyndcliffe, from which may be seen one of the loveliest views in all England. The boat was full of excursionists, of course, and everybody, as very often happens, was discussing everybody else. The usual newly married couple was soon singled out and heartlessly pulled to bits. And so was the old snob from London, loud of voice and full as to his pockets with brandy flasks and bank notes. The three young men, quietly smoking short pipes on the paddle box, were evidently on a walking tour. The tallest and handsomest of the three interested Edith singularly. He laughed so loud and was so full of fun, and at the same time seemed to talk so well and sensibly, for she could not help hearing every word that was said, that she took to him at once, and somehow or other, when there was a lull in the conversation, Edith's eyes wandered away from the scenery and invariably met his, which were constantly fixed on her. Wherever they went, they met that day, on the steps of the hotel at Chepstow, in the little arbour on the topmost heights of the Wyndcliffe, amidst the ruins of Tintern Abbey. They seemed to be drawn together by a kind of fate, and the last time they came across one another they could not possibly help smiling. Of course they never spoke, and of course when evening came on they were many miles apart. The same face that haunted Edith all that day now seemed to pursue her wherever she went in London. At last they met at a public ball in London and were very soon introduced to one another. They had a good laugh over what they chose to call quite a romantic adventure, and soon became firm friends. They danced repeatedly together that evening, and talked long and earnestly about the chance of meeting again, and even made arrangements about reserved waltzes and special quadrilles in case they did. "What a singularly handsome and gentlemanly man Lord Roseworth is," said Aunt Rachel, as they drove home from the ball in the early hours of the morning. "And who might he be?" replied Edith, knowing well her aunt's particular hobby about well-bred people, and imagining she had been whiling away the time in the enjoyment of a quiet tête-à-tête with some aristocratic old beau. "Why, surely, my dear child, you know who that young man was with whom you were dancing so repeatedly, and whose conversation seemed to please you vastly." "Is his name Lord Roseworth? A real live lord? You don't say so. I never knew that the nobility could be half so entertaining. He is a most delightful man, one of the nicest men, in fact, I have ever met." Aunt Rachel was delighted. Here was an opportunity, what a chance to try her hand at match-making, a match indeed that would do her such infinite credit. She determined she would try. Edith guessed the meaning of all the unusual affection on separating for the night, and now for the first time understood why she had been allowed to make herself conspicuous with Lord Roseworth that evening. She determined, however, to flatter the good lady's vanity so far as to withhold from her all about the Tintern Abbey meeting, in order to make her believe that she was ready to be guided by her aunt's sound advice. After that, Edith Everest and Lord Roseworth met constantly, and Aunt Rachel helped on the love-making wonderfully. Little Mabel Everest was woke up very early one sunny summer morning by someone entering her room. Her sister stood at the foot of the bed looking very lovely, but evidently just returned from a ball, as her tumbled dress and faded flowers showed. In a few moments the two sisters were clasped in one another's arms, and both were shedding tears. Little Mabel's tears sprung from her heart and were very bitter, but Edith's were tears of joy. Edith Everest and Lord Roseworth were engaged to be married. About this time everybody noticed how ill Mr. Everest was looking, and remarked that he seemed vexed and anxious. He was evidently working too hard, and his daughters used to protest against the late hours in the city, and declared it was high time for him to give up work, and live quietly at home and enjoy himself. If there was one thing he disliked talking about more than another, it was his daughter's engagement. Both the young people were anxious that some understanding should be come to on the matter, for Mr. Everest had really never formally given his consent. Lord Roseworth's appeals had been put off from time to time, and Aunt Rachel's advice had been quietly resisted. Edith was not at all anxious to force the matter on her father, as she was well aware it seemed a painful subject to him. He did not like the idea of parting with her, she thought, and she loved him for it more than ever. At last, however, Lord Roseworth persuaded her to try what her influence would do, so one morning she followed her father after breakfast into the study. For the first time in their life, the father and daughter seemed constrained. Mr. Everest walked about the room uneasily and talked about the most indifferent subjects, while Edith stood by the fireplace, nervously playing with her watch chain. At last she spoke out boldly, and he was obliged to listen. After the affair had been quietly discussed some little time, Edith said quietly, "Tell me, my dear father, your real opinion about the matter. You know I will be guided by you in everything. Have you any very serious objection?" "Not in the least, my child, not in the least." And then he came quite close to her, and when he had kissed her, he said, "It is no use beating about the bush. We have never hid any secrets from one another, have we, my child? You must know everything one day or other, so it may just as well be known at once." Edith shuddered at those words, and looked earnestly at her father as he went on. "It has nothing whatever to do with Lord Roseworth. He is an excellent fellow in his way, and would, I trust, make you a good husband. But do you think, my child, he would care to marry a girl without a penny? He thinks you are an heiress, Edith, and so you were. I have ruined you as well as myself." "Ruined, father? Absolutely ruined? You can't mean that." "Yes, Edith, it is only too true. Everything has turned out badly with me lately. I thought to make matters better by speculating madly. Now I've lost nearly everything. If I were young and active as I once was, I should not care so much. But these last few years have aged me wonderfully, and I am almost past work. But God's will be done, my darling. God's will be done." Great big tears rolled down the poor man's face as he spoke thus, and looked imploringly at his daughter. She bore up wonderfully, and tried to comfort him, and persuade him that all perhaps might be well. "You were always my right hand, Edith, and I am sure you will bear with me now. Besides, you have courage, and will always make your way. My heart sinks, though, when I think of the misery I have brought on poor Mabel." "Don't fret yourself about Mabel, father. We will take care of her, and when she is old enough, I'll find her a husband, and make her as happy as I shall be." "You will take care of her? A husband? Happy?" murmured the old man. "Yes, why, of course, matters are not nearly so black as they look. Lord Roseworth has quite enough for us all to live upon for a time, and I am sure his kind, generous heart would be the first to feel for us." "My poor child, my poor, poor child," sobbed Mr. Everest. He could say no more, but he thought of the pain and sorrow that might be in store for this noble girl, and moaned again in anguish at the misery he had caused. "Promise me one thing, Edith," said her father before they parted. "Do not breathe a word of all this just yet. Nothing is at all definitely settled, but I shall receive a letter in a few days, which will decide our fate. Meanwhile, we will all go down to Riverside for a week, and try to forget all about the misery and sorrow that seems threatening in the distance. Write one line to Arthur Oldham, who has just returned from Italy, and ask him to come down to us as usual on Saturday, if you don't mind, and if you can possibly contrive to exist without seeing Lord Roseworth for a week, you will oblige me excessively. Send him a note, however, to say that his anxiety will soon be relieved. The letter must come by the end of the week, and that will settle everything." Accordingly, they all went down to Riverside, and Arthur Oldham came on the Saturday. He noticed the fretful anxiety of Mr. Everest, and his heart bled at the sight of Edith's pale, careworn face. He knew nothing of what had passed between the father and daughter, and there had been no time for him to hear of Edith's engagement, but he had heard something very serious at Marseilles, and felt he had a duty to perform. Arthur and Edith walked together in the woods on the Sunday evening, and he was determined, cost what it might, to tell her all. "I have something most important to tell you," said he, "something which I am sure you ought to know, but I never really felt such a difficulty in speaking to you as I do now." "Nonsense, Arthur," said his cousin. "We must never have any secrets, and I somehow fancy the day is not very far distant when I shall want your serious assistance." "The fact is," said Arthur, "I heard from the very best authority at Marseilles that your father's affairs were in a terrible condition, and that the failure of his house was all but imminent." Edith became deadly pale, and turning away said, "It can't be true." "Let us hope and pray that it is not," said Arthur. "At any rate, I felt that you, of all others, ought to know this. And there is another thing which you ought and which you must know, Edith, no matter what fate is in store for both of us. I love you with all my heart and soul, and would work for you to the last day of my life." Edith removed from his arm the hand which he was clasping passionately, and said to him almost fiercely, "You have no right to talk to me like this. I am engaged." Poor Arthur could hardly keep back his tears. He struggled bravely to explain that he knew nothing of what had passed while he was away, and to apologize for his hastiness, but he utterly broke down, and leaving his cousin as soon as he could, had his dark hour unseen, and rose and passed, bearing a lifelong hunger in his heart. But Arthur Oldham went up to London that night with Edith's, as well as Mabel's, kisses fresh on his lips. They were both his sisters now. And so they were all back again at pleasant Riverside, but somehow or other a dark cloud seemed to be hanging over the once merry little family. No one thought of alluding to the difference, but it was very evident that both father and daughters felt that something was amiss. Mabel, who was, of course, entirely ignorant of the real cause of the melancholy fit, which seemed so entirely to have taken possession of her father and sister, tried to laugh it all off, and to tease the refractory ones into happiness again, but Edith resisted all her pretty sister's entreaties to accompany her in the little boat along the backwater in search of water lilies and forget-me-nots for the drawing-room table, and Mr. Everest could not be persuaded to shake off his gloominess and ramble with Mabel in the woods to hunt out new specimens for her fern case. On the Friday evening, after Arthur Oldham had left, a letter arrived for Mr. Everest, and Edith contrived to get her father alone before going to bed, in order to ask him about its contents. "Well, nothing is absolutely settled, my darling, after all," said he, "but it will be necessary for me to go up to London by the very first train. Just tell the servants to call me by 6 o'clock, and even earlier if possible. I shall have a good deal of work to do before starting. Don't you think of getting up in the morning, as they will get me my breakfast, and I don't intend to rob you of any of the sleep which will do you so much good after all this worry." "It is not very likely I shall let you leave us in that miserable way, you silly man," said Edith, kissing her father affectionately. "I shall get up and see after you, of course. At any rate, try and get this horrid business over as quickly as you can, and mind and come back to-morrow evening and let me know how you have sped." Mr. Everest turned away his head and sighed bitterly, but then, seeming to recollect himself, he moved to his daughter again, saying, "Well, good-bye, and God bless you, my very darling child." "Not good-bye, not good-bye," replied Mabel through her tears. The tears were rolling fast down the poor old man's cheeks. Again and again he pressed his daughter to his heart and covered her face with kisses, and so they parted for the night. In the dull haze of the early morning Edith Everest was awakened by a dull, heavy knocking, which seemed to echo through the house. She had passed a miserable, restless night, and had lain awake for hours, fearful lest she should by chance oversleep herself, and anxious about the events of the last few weeks. Nature, however, at last would have her way, and towards morning Edith fell into a deep sleep. At first the knocking was somehow mixed up with her dream, and though she evidently heard it, she was not conscious enough to be really disturbed. At last a long, piercing, awful shriek rang through the half-empty house, and then the poor girl sat up terrified in her bed. The shriek was still echoing in her ears as she began to collect her thoughts. All at once a terrible suspicion flashed across her, and it was the work of a moment to wrap a shawl hurriedly round her shoulders and to hasten downstairs. Outside her father's dressing-room door stood the servant who had been appointed to call him, wringing her hands and moaning loudly. "Oh, Miss Edith, for heaven's sake, don't go in there. Something terrible must have happened to master. He's lying on the ground and won't speak." Edith, pale as death and speechless, hurried past the servant and flew into the room. A faint, sickly smell seemed to pervade the apartment, and as she entered, her foot struck upon something which rolled away under the wardrobe. Nerving herself to the uttermost, she waved away a whole crowd of servants that were hurrying into the room. And then she shut the door and was alone with her dead father. The first thing she did was to secure that suspicious something which had rolled away. It was a little phial. She next stooped to kiss the lips which but a few hours before had whispered "God bless you" in her ears. But the faint, sickly smell was overpowering her, and with difficulty she reached the door, round which the whole household was now gathered. "Your master has died suddenly," she murmured. "It must have been heart disease." And then she turned round and locked the door. This done, she went slowly back to her own room, but her nerves would stand no more. Directly she had thrown herself on her bed, she fainted away, with the key of the dressing-room tightly clasped in her hand. End of section 14.